A few years ago, I read a book called The History of the World in Six Glasses. And what that book did is it told the entire history of the world in 6 different beverages. Now, we're not going to quite do that today, but we're going to come close. We're going to do the history of family ministry in 5 sketches, 5 drawings is what we're going to do. Now, I give this as a tool to you for you to help the people in your church perhaps understand how we got to do things the way we do them in our churches, why we do things the way we do them, and how that happened from the 1800s to the present. So our 5 sketches are going to cover from the 1800s to the present time. Now the first of these 5 sketches looks kind of like an octopus, we might say. It's got a large circle in the middle, a lot of little circles around it that are loosely connected to that large circle. Now let's let that large circle symbolize the church in the 1800s. And each of those little circles around it, the societies. Now you and I already talked about earlier the societies that happened during the 1800s that came about during that time. The Society for Christian Endeavor, the YMCA, the Sunday School Society. We've already talked about those together. But what we're going to look at now is the impact of that and how that began to change in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. So you had a church that was loosely connected with several different societies, none of which the church funded and none of which really the church had any direct oversight over during the 1800s into the early 1900s. Now there were a couple of weaknesses in the society movement. A couple of those were, one of them was fundraising. Because what might happen, because they weren't actually getting a budget line item from the church, we might say, because of that, these societies had to raise funds themselves. So if you're a member of a church and you had people from your church involved in a society, what might happen to you is you've got somebody knocking on your door saying, hey, some of your youth are involved in the Society for Christian Endeavor or the Young People's Association. Don't you want to fund this society? Or you might have somebody saying, don't you care about missions? And if you really do, you'll want to help fund the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel to the Heathen, which actually was in the late 1800s a real society for missions. So that was one of the issues, was fundraising. All of those little circles outside around that big circles, the societies outside the church that were loosely connected to it, all were trying to raise money separately. There's another issue as well, and that is that as theological liberalism throughout the 1800s began to go deeper and deeper into many American churches, what they found was that many of the churches became hesitant to involve their people, particularly their young people, in these societies because they couldn't be certain of the theological integrity of these societies. Those were some of the weaknesses of the society movement. Well, what begins to eclipse and metamorphose these societies in the early 20th century in particular was the efficiency movement. The efficiency movement. Now the drawing we're going to use to symbolize the efficiency movement looks a little like an amoeba, we might say. So what we see is that all those societies that were out scattered, loosely connected to the church, have been drawn inside the church, had been drawn and centralized in the congregation. So to help us understand that, we need to look at the efficiency movement in the broader world. This isn't something just about churches. This was in the broader world during the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. We'll put it from about the 1880s into the time of the start of the Great Depression in the United States. That was the era of the efficiency movement. Now, the emphasis in the efficiency movement was the improvement of systems everywhere. So there were experts and consultants. You find a very strong emphasis on finding somebody who is an expert or a consultant in a particular area who can help you do this more efficiently, whatever it is you're doing. And you find that there was intensive scientific analysis in every field: medicine, engineering, city planning, factory design. All those different parts of the world and of society were being analyzed to make sure they were as efficient as they could possibly be. And if we were to say that there are 3 words that describe the efficiency movement, it would be specialization, professionalization, and standardization. Specialization, professionalization, and standardization. Specialization, that you find people who specialize in a particular area. No generalist, but somebody who specializes in a particular area. You pay them, professionalize this, and you standardize the way we do things. You make it standard across the board in this. Now, this was, as I said, applied in so many different areas, not merely factories, not merely churches, but across the board, so many different areas we're looking for how can we be more efficient. In fact, there were even hearings hearings on efficiency before the House of Representatives in the United States about the need for professional experts to be able to do things right. One of the leaders in the efficiency movement was a man named Frederick Winslow Taylor. And in his hearings before the United States House of Representatives, here's what he had to say. The man who is physically able to handle pig iron and is sufficiently stupid to choose this for his occupation is rarely able to comprehend the science of handling pig iron. Now, what he meant by that was anybody who's actually working with iron and working in the plants that are producing iron, those people that were doing that, they weren't smart enough to figure out how to do it best. What we need is efficiency experts, consultants to come in and show them and tell them how to do their job more effectively. Now, this was part of the whole spirit of the age during the late 1800s and then on into the early 1900s. It wasn't only Frederick Winslow Taylor. What we find, in fact, is that Henry Ford incorporated many of these scientific principles of efficiency into his factories and into his assembly lines, completely separate from Frederick Winslow Taylor and others. But what's interesting is that we find that churches readily embraced the efficiency movement, particularly Southern Baptist churches readily embraced the efficiency movement to try to do things more effectively in their churches. So, for example, in 1909, there's a text on church administration that declared every church needs to develop 3 trained experts in addition to the pastor. And those 3 trained experts were a director of religious education, a director of social work, and a director of church visitation. But what's more interesting is the reason that's given in this book on church administration for why every church needs these 3 experts. The reason it gives is that church members have not the technical training to do things as they ought to be done. In other words, what it's trying to communicate there is that church members, like the handlers of pig iron, aren't sufficiently smart to be able to figure out how to do things. Therefore, we have to have experts, professionals, to show them how it ought to be done, but not merely to show it how it ought to be done, but in some sense to do it in their place or to do it for them. Well, one of the results of this in the long term is what we might call a deferral culture. This idea of turning things over, turning tasks over to staff specialists in our churches. And as I said, the efficiency movement was incredibly popular. In fact, in 1915, W.A. Hobson, who was the editor of the Florida Baptist Witness, said this. He said, "Efficiency in Christian service is the true test of orthodoxy." And he went on to say that evangelism and efficiency were the 2 great fundamental things in the teaching of Christ and of his apostles. That's how big the efficiency movement was, particularly in Southern Baptist churches in the early 1900s. Now, when we look at the societies and think about the societies, what ends up happening in the efficiency movement is those societies that were loosely connected to the church with this emphasis on centralization and professionalization, they were pulled into the church so that they became church programs that were directly overseen by the church, directly funded by the church, and if at all possible, had a professional or an expert overseeing them in the church. Now, we can see a lot of negative things to do with the efficiency movement, but we've also got to admit that there are some positive things that came out of it. In fact, what you are doing right now in education at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is in some sense, you're a recipient of some of the good of the efficiency movement. Because you see, in 1919, the 75 million campaign was launched. Now the 75 million campaign, it was a 5-year centralized giving program to support SBC entities. So to support the seminaries, to support the mission boards, to support all of that. A centralized giving program, very efficiency movement in its perspective of that centralization. Now in 1925, the 75 million campaign was turned into something that became long-standing called the cooperative program that to this day still funds a large part of the education that you're receiving at this time. So in some sense, right now you are living in the shadow of the efficiency movement by the fact that you're receiving a less expensive education through the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, after the Second World War, there was an invention that revolutionized Western culture. Now, you may be thinking, oh, it was the atomic bomb, or it was some other thing that's come out of military research, this invention. But this invention wasn't anything that came from military research. This invention wasn't anything that came from a factory, didn't come from an assembly line. The invention that came after World War II that revolutionized Western culture was the invention of the teenager. In fact, the very word teenager wasn't invented until the 1940s, believe it or not. Now, you may be thinking as I say that, well, there have always been teenagers. There have always been people from the age of 13 to 19. Nobody's yet figured out how to skip those years, although if somebody did, I think it'd be a big seller if they figured out a product to do that. But nobody's yet figured out how to skip those years, and so in some sense there have always been teenagers. And so the fact of the teenage years is ancient, but the function of the teenage years as we know it are a relatively new invention. What I mean by that is that in the mid-20th century, the teenage years shifted from an intermediary stage of life with the goal of adulthood. And in many cultures, that movement into adulthood marked by a rite of passage. So it moves from this intermediary stage of life with the goal of adulthood. And in the mid-20th century, it becomes a distinct social phenomenon that resists movement toward adulthood. So if the teenage years as we know them are a new invention, we have to ask this: who invented the teenager and how did it happen? Well, let's remember first that the Industrial Revolution had already birthed societies, and these societies brought people together on the basis of common interests or common age, or just bringing them together on things that they all had in common at some level. But then there were some other factors that influenced this creation of the teenage years as we know them. In the middle of the 19th century, a man named Horace Mann pressed for compulsory public education. He was speaking of just younger children, but he pressed for this practice of compulsory public education. Now, the reason Horace Mann did that is he really believed that if everybody had the same education, everybody would have the same opportunities, and therefore everybody would have similar wealth. He was really desirous of that, and he said that if we equitably diffuse education, it will become the great equalizer in the social order. And for that reason, he wanted compulsory public education. Now, later in the 19th century, another factor becomes involved in this. The Supreme Court gives the okay for tax dollars to be used to support free secondary schools. Now, that opened the door for compulsory education, not merely of younger children, but also of those in their teenage years. So we've got another movement then in the 20th century. What we see beginning to happen in urban areas in the 20th century is a movement toward compulsory high school education, especially in urban areas. In fact, one of the factors in that is during the Great Depression in certain areas, they were trying to move teenagers out of the job market, and so made education compulsory for them to move teenagers out of the job market so that there would be more jobs for adults. And so all of these different factors that are separate factors, but they come together to develop more and more a separation between teenagers and the adult world. So you've got all these different factors of compulsory education, pulling them out of the workforce. And you've got this idea of already clustering on the basis of common interest or common age, and it begins this movement toward a separation of teenagers from the adult world and from adult life. But after World War II is when we really see this taking off. And what happened after World War II is, for the first time in history, adolescents received enough money, spending money, given to them by their parents to be able to influence the market in significant ways. They were giving spending money. Now, this may sound odd to us that this was a new thing, but in the middle of the 20th century, it was a new thing. You had parents who, many of them had endured a Great Depression, and many of them had endured the Second World War, and there was an indulgence in terms of their children that they gave them money in ways that simply had not been the case before, especially with the surge in economic opportunities from many people coming back after World War II. In fact, they recognized it even in the 1950s. In Billboard magazine in 1958, there's an article that states this: today's 9 to 14-year-old group is the first generation with enough money given to them by their parents to buy records in sufficient quantities to influence the market. In my youth, the writer says, if I had asked my father for 45 cents to buy a record, he'd have thought seriously about having me committed. This is in the 1950s they say this. They realized even then that it was a new thing, what was happening, the idea of adolescents having the money to be able to influence the market in significant ways. ways. But one of the results of that was age-focused marketing. Age-focused marketing, products and music that were aimed at particular age groups. Now, we live in a world where we see that all the time. There's all sorts of products and music that are aimed at particular age groups, but this was a relatively new phenomenon in the middle of the 20th century. Well, one of the results of this was what we might call, and what has been called, a generation gap. That the youth had a different culture from their parents. And for the most part, churches did not deal well with this separation, this generation gap between the adults and the teenagers. And in some sense, the churches were not able to figure out, how do we reach teenagers? And in the midst of that, a couple of organizations arose. Young Life, Youth for Christ. Many of you watching this may have been impacted at some time in your life by Young Life or Youth for Christ. Well, these arose in the middle of the 20th century in large part to do what churches they felt like weren't doing, which is reaching the youth, reaching this new rising youth generation. So as Young Life and Youth for Christ became more and more popular, many churches basically tried to replicate those programs in their congregations. They had a youth group that was similar to, doing the same things as Young Life and Youth for Christ, but doing it more connected to their churches. And so what we'll use to symbolize that is a drawing that looks a lot like the earlier one, to do with the efficiency movement, a circle with a lot of little circles inside it. But there's one difference you'll notice, and that's that one of those circles is barely hanging on to the rest. It's kind of outside the big circle, the church, and barely attached to it. That we're going to say is the youth group. So you've got the large circle that's the church, all the other little circles that are the programs, but then the youth program is barely connected to the rest of the congregation. Now, what happens in that era is that the churches begin to, in essence, say, we're going to have a youth group and we're going to send the youth out there and to be involved in that and to have fun in that for these years. And then maybe when they grow up, when they start growing up, when they become mature, they'll come back in to the church. And so the youth group ran in sort of a separate track from the rest of the congregation. It was a separate reality from them. And that little spot where the youth group and the church intersect there on that one-eared Mickey Mouse, the spot right there, there was an individual that was hired to be able to mediate those two worlds, we might say. And that individual was supposed to be cool enough to attract people, to attract young people to the youth group on the outside, but also mature enough to survive a deacon's meeting on the inside. And of course, that person was the youth director or the youth minister. Those began to be hired in the mid-20th century and increasingly throughout the 20th century. And so we have the advent of the modern youth movement. Now, as I said, there's precedence to it in the 1800s and even earlier than that. But as we know it today, it begins in the mid-20th century with this individual who's hired to oversee the youth programs, and that the generation gap, the way that that's responded to is by creating, in essence, a separate program from the rest of the congregation. But there's another change as it moves from Young Life, Youth for Christ, parachurch organizations to these church-sponsored groups. As it moves from parachurch to church groups, the focus shifted from evangelizing lost youth to retaining and entertaining churched youth. The emphasis changes at that point in this one-eared Mickey Mouse. Now, what happens in the last half of the 20th century is this generation gap grows until adolescence becomes really its own culture unto itself. And the adolescent years become years that are marked by an expectation of maximum indulgence and maximum freedom, coupled with minimum responsibilities and minimum supervision. And they're increasingly perceived, these adolescent years, as the best years of one's life. The place we have to look to understand that, we only have to look as far as Bryan Adams in the summer of '69. Remember the words for that: when I look back now, that summer seemed to last forever, and if I had the choice, I'd always want to be there. Those were the best days of my life. Another similar song from the same era that kind of expresses this idea that these adolescent years are supposed to be the best years of your life. John Cougar Mellencamp, his song Jack and Diane. Oh yeah, life goes on long after the thrill of living is gone. So hold on to 16 as long as you can, because changes come real soon. Make us women and men. And of course, if Bryan Adams and John Cougar Mellencamp say it, you know it's the truth, of course, at that point. But we see in this that this idea of adolescence as being this time of maximum freedom, maximum indulgence, minimum responsibility, and that these are the best years of our lives. Now, what ends up happening in that, in terms of the function of adolescence, is increasingly, as we grow toward our present era, there's the idea of get into adolescence as quickly as you can. You start seeing early sexualization of children in which they're expected to get into adolescence as quick as they can and stay there as long as they can. That is to say, increasingly, there's the phenomenon that we call extended adolescence or adultolescence, I've even seen it called, in which adolescence extends into the 20s and into the 30s of adulthood. And so you see this phenomenon, stay there as long as you can, and then you've got to work for an era. But then in some sense in our culture, retirement has become a time to return to those adolescent years, or at least return to that maximum indulgence, minimum responsibility. So we see this expansion of adolescence and this perception of adolescence as the ideal. This is radically different from any generation before, in which the years of adolescence were considered to be a time of preparation for adulthood, and now they've increasingly become an ideal to which we aspire. Adulthood isn't the ideal, rather adolescence is the ideal. Well, in terms of churches, what happens in church organization is we come from the one-eared Mickey Mouse to yet another sort of a way of the church organization. And so that we can symbolize by this ring of circles loosely connected to one another, a ring of little circles loosely connected to one another. And what that is intended to symbolize or to point to is the fact that what happens during the last part of the 20th century is increasingly people were saying, well, you've got a youth ministry, we also need a children's ministry separate from the congregation as a whole, and a preschool and a senior adult ministry, and a this ministry and a that ministry, until everybody wants their own ear on the Mickey Mouse, we might say. And the church becomes this ring of loosely connected, separated programs. It becomes siloed, we might say. So each person in each ministry is in their own silo, that they pursue ministry separately, they pursue discipleship separately from one another. And once a week at staff meeting, everybody opens the window on their silo, so to speak, and asks, is everybody okay in yours? And do you have anything on your calendar I need to know about? And everything's okay over here. And everybody shuts the doors and goes back to their very separated ministries. That's church as I knew it in the late 20th century and early 21st century. And probably you've seen evidence of that yourself. That's where we're at in terms of our churches, this separation from one another. Now, what has happened at the end of the 20th and the early 21st century is a movement toward family ministry. And part of the impulse behind family ministry is, how do we get rid of the silos? How do we bring people back together again? Now that brings us to the fifth drawing, the more complicated drawing that you see. A circle with circles kind of half inside, half outside, with arrows going inward and outward. Now that represents not so much the reality that we have presently as a hope and a dream for the future. If you'll notice in that, all those different individual programs that had gotten separated out in those eras of separation, they're still there, but they're drawn into that larger body of the church. And what that's intended to indicate is that in this new way of looking at things, a person's central identity and central place of discipleship is not their individualized group, but it is the body of Christ as a whole, the intergenerational, multi-generational body of Christ, people drawn together. Their central place of ministry, their central place of service. They don't say, well, I serve with the youth group. Rather, I serve Christ in the context of this church. And the particular context where I'm at right now is the youth ministry, but I'm serving Christ in the context of my church as a whole. Now that's what that inward arrow and that kind of overlapping that's drawing those programs in, it indicates, is that rootedness in the multi-generational body where we recognize we need one another as the body of Christ. Those outward arrows, what those are intended to suggest is the fact that the reason we gather together into individual programs or small programs is not for the sake of just making things fun for me, making things interesting for me, making sure I have people that are like me around me. That's not the purpose for that. The purpose we have individual age-organized ministries or interest-organized ministries is for the sake of reaching the world around us. So what we would communicate to the youth in this is that the reason we're drawing you together in a youth group isn't so you can just have these best years of your life. It's rather so that you can be on mission to reach youth and to reach people that the rest of us may not be able to reach. And the same with the senior adult program. The reason we have this senior adult program isn't so you can go on your fun little activities together, though that's perfectly okay, but the purpose of that is not the activities. The purpose of you having this ministry is for you to be on mission in the world with people that you can reach that the rest of us may not be able to. That's the vision of coordination that I have for the future of the organization of the church. That's much of what we're trying to do in family ministry, is to aim churches toward that so that they see that it's not about just a conglomeration of programs. Rather, we need one another, and the reason we have the programs is for the sake of mission to the world, not simply for the sake of our own interest or benefit.